Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Saifedean Ammous, author of The Gold Standard. Saifedean, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Colin. It's a pleasure.
Well, I just would like to start with you because on this podcast I have historical novelist. You're not known as a historical novelist. You're known more as an economist, I'm sorry, but you're very well known and accomplished. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and why we should know you, even though some of my readers might not be familiar with you?
Yeah, so this is my first fiction book, and before that, I published three economics books, nonfiction. The most successful and famous of them is The Bitcoin Standard. It's a book on Bitcoin. I've also written a book called The Fiat Standard, which is a sequel, and it's focusing on the interaction between Bitcoin and government money. And then my third book was a textbook in economics, Principles of Economics, university level textbook, although not really a textbook, more of a an introduction to the ideas of economics from what is known as the Austrian school, which I consider myself a part of. I used to be a university professor. I got a PhD at Columbia University in sustainable development. I taught economics for 10 years at the Lebanese American University. Then I fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, as we call it, started reading and writing about Bitcoin. And then in 2017, decided to write a book on Bitcoin. That became the Bitcoin Standard. And then I left my university job and focused only on writing and teaching online on Bitcoin. And after three successful books, I'd always had this idea of trying to communicate my economic ideas through a historical thought experiment. And I've always wanted to do this, and I did end up doing it in the book that was published as The Gold Standard. It's a thought experiment of what the world would have looked like had the world stayed on the gold standard.
Yeah, so this is an alternate history. Tell us a little bit more about what you were imagining, but can you actually inform me even a little bit more on when did we use the gold standard and why did we go away from that in the first place?
So, at the end of the 19th century, practically the entire planet was on a gold standard. Some countries were still on a silver standard, but even there, gold was still very commonly used as money. And before that, people had used gold as money for 5,000 years, perhaps thousands of years. We're not sure how many. But for thousands of years, people had used gold as money. And by the end of the 19th century, the whole planet was on gold as money. And this was what was named the La Belle Époque in French, or the Golden Victorian Age. And it was, the late 19th century was one of the most, uh, possibly you could argue, the pinnacle of human civilization. It was the time in which so many people were being transformed. So many lives were being transformed and improved because of technological and economic improvements. The Industrial Revolution was being spread all over the world. And I believe the gold standard played a big part in that. Then the world went off the gold standard in 1914. Most people would say 1971, but I think it's more accurate to say 1914 with the start of World War One, because then the major economies got into a war and they weren't to fight the war, and they needed to finance the war. And of course, their people did not like the idea of paying a lot of taxes to fight wars that they didn't quite understand. And if you read the history of World War One, you can understand the skepticism that the average British, German, French person, Russian person, Austrian person would have had about paying money for a war that seemed to make no sense. Why were we fighting all these countries? And people didn't want to pay for them. But the way that the governments managed to keep the war going was by going off the gold standard, because that allows them to increase the money supply and not have to redeem the money supply for gold. So the point of the gold standard is that it restricts the government's ability to print money, because the money has to be redeemed for gold. So if the government prints too much money, then it can no longer redeem its money for gold. So the value of its currency drops or maybe even collapses. So by suspending the gold standard, they can increase the supply of money, and now they don't need to redeem the money. And so that allows them essentially to mobilize resources, effectively stealing wealth from people in the country, to finance the war. And that's exactly what happened in World War One. And it didn't stop with World War One, because after World War One, all of the governments had gone off the gold standard, and basically they never went back. They just continued to abuse that privilege because it's too tempting. The idea that you could be in power and just print money and use it to buy whatever you want, fight wars, buy elections, build palaces, whatever it is that you want, it can be done with money. And if you've got a money printer, then you can do it. So the way that I see it, and the way that I explain it in my other books, is that essentially human civilization has taken a massive detour away from progress to regression and degeneration and decivilization over the past 100 years, because we've destroyed the integrity of money, and we've destroyed the role of money in society. We've destroyed money's ability to hold value. We've destroyed people's ability to save, all in order to finance government spending. And that has been absolutely catastrophic. It's led to wars lasting for so long. It's led to continuous increased wars all over the place. And it's led to governments becoming more and more and more powerful. It's led to politics becoming extremely important, because being in power just allows you to be essentially godlike in your power, because you can just create money. And you see this, with the current president of the U.S., just the ability to go into wars, to spend all kinds of insane amounts of money without the American people really realizing that they are paying for it, because they don't think they're paying for it. They think the government can just make money out of thin air, and they don't realize that they're actually paying for it in rising prices. If you wonder why your prices are rising, it's because of the wars. It's because of all the stupid things that the government spends money on. And if you had a gold standard, if you had a hard money standard, then this would not be possible.
Well, that's a very good explanation. It's all very interesting. Um, Tell us now more about the gold standard, your book here. Well, first of all, maybe you could define the genre for us a little bit, because I read that it's one third novel, one third economics, one third history. How did you combine all these different, ways of telling this story to make it understandable and compelling for readers?
Well, the initial idea was that I wanted this to communicate my idea about the importance of hard money versus easy money, and the damage that fiat money has done to the century, to humanity over the past century. So I had different ways of thinking about it. And at some point, I thought I could write a textbook, a history textbook, where I'm just looking at a fictional history of the 20th century. That was one idea. Another idea was a novel. And I saw the merits of both ideas, but I saw, I couldn't quite go with one, because I thought there would be too much benefit from having the other one. So making it all into one dry textbook about an imaginary century, even though it might be interesting to read about this imaginary century, but you're not going to read a lot. It's not going to be that interesting and that captivating. To textbooks are not the most engaging reading, and a textbook about a fake world is going to have to get into a lot of details that are just going to be not very interesting to the reader. So, and it wouldn't be a very good way of trying to communicate how this alternative history came about. So it needed an element of storytelling. It needed an element of a novel, where you can communicate the idea of how this change came about. Why is it that we ended up taking this fork in the road in this story? So that would have been more suitable for a novel. And then you needed to look at the economics of it, and you needed to look at the history of it. So I essentially combined all three. So the first part of the book is the history of the world leading up to 1914. And that part of the book is real history. So about a third of the book is the history of the world up to 1914, 1915. And then the second part of the book is the how the world goes off the gold standard, and this is more of a novel. And this is a few pivotal characters in the early 20th century make a few different decisions, and then that causes humanity to go on a very different trajectory. And then the third section of the book is the sort of textbook that looks back at the century and looks at data and um, looks at the evolution of the economics and energy use and a little bit of the kind of technical aspects of how an economy would evolve. And I thought each one of these three is necessary to communicate the general picture that I wanted to do. So that's why I ventured into the field of fictional writing, even though it's not my it's not something that I'd done before, but I thought I would take a shot at it.
Well, I applaud you for doing it in that style. I was listening to your first four chapters that you recorded on YouTube this morning, and just giving that straight context really helped me because, as I've said, I'm pretty ignorant in these matters related to economic history and everything about World War One and the economics that you explained here earlier in this interview. So I think that really helps readers to understand what was going on with the money systems and how we changed from the gold standard to getting off the gold standard, and then being able to be immersed in this fictional alternative world. So I think that's really well done that way. I wonder. So now that you've kind of explored this alternative history, what are the lessons that can be taken away based on where we're at today? Like, what can we do about it now that we have all this information?
Well, perhaps before we get into the lessons, maybe I should try and give a little bit about a little bit of an idea of how the century evolves differently in that world. So, in this story, what happens? The difference, the sliding door of history, in is that in the early 20th century, the aviation industry grows faster than it did. And if you look at the history of aviation, and this is something that has always fascinated me, I studied mechanical engineering and I've always been fascinated by airplanes. And every time I get on an airplane, it just blows my mind that it actually happens. I've always studied, and the more I study about it, the more miraculous it seems to me. So if you look at the history of aviation when it first came about, the Wright brothers were the first to fly, and they invented the technology that made flight possible, that is still used in flights today, in airplanes today. But after they invented it, they did something that was extremely bad, in my opinion, which is they, instead of focusing on trying to improve the airplanes, make better airplanes, make more airplanes, get more funding for more airplanes, and sell more airplanes, they focused on trying to sue everybody to stop them from building airplanes. And the result was that aviation was really slowed down in the first decade because the Wright brothers were suing everybody. And anytime somebody would make an innovation, anytime somebody would win an award for flying in a contest or something like that, their lawyers would be there and they'd file a lawsuit. And so all of the brightest minds of innovation of aviation, instead of actually sitting in their workshops and making better airplanes, they were in courtrooms and talking to lawyers. So what I do in this book is there's a real character called Oliver Chanut. Chanut, he was a French American aviation pioneer, and he was one of the influential people who developed a lot of the technologies that helped bring about aviation. And I just, in the real world, he wasn't very happy about the way the Wright brothers were suing everybody, and he said something about this in the real world. So I just went with that, and I said, well, what if this guy Chanut, writes them a letter telling them, stop doing this stupid nonsense. Instead of just continuously suing each other, why don't you just go and build a better airplane? And so they do this in 1911, and he writes them a letter, and the Wright brothers just a switch is flipped in their mind, and they just decide, what, we're not going to be talking to lawyers anymore. We're just going to build a better airplane. And so they go back to the workshop. And in fact, if you look in the real world, the the uh, the Wright brothers really, one of them died young because of all the stress of the courtroom battles and traveling all over the country suing people. And in this story, the opposite happens. They get back into the lab, into their workshop, and they start building airplanes, and they're happy and they're very jovial about it. And so they start making airplanes. And then all of the pioneers in aviation across the world, they also start innovating and improving on aviation, and things keep getting better and airplanes get a lot faster. So why this matters is that by the time World War One comes about in our alternative history, airplanes have a faster range and are more efficient. And this character that I make the sort of pivotal character in the film is a guy called Louis Blériot. He's a real person who was the first to fly across the channel from France to England, and he was an automobile pioneer. He was the guy who invented the headlight. So we all have him to thank for being able to drive in the dark. He invented the headlight, made a fortune, and this is all real. Flew across the Atlantic, became one of the earliest pioneers, set up his company, and his company is one of the most important early French companies, which later was merged with other companies to become Airbus. And so this guy, I just turn him into this entrepreneurial genius who decides to partner with the Wright brothers to build, to try and scale airplanes, to try and make airplanes become a commercially viable proposition, so that he can stimulate the growth of the airplane industry. He wants a commercial application for airplanes. And he realizes that at this point, it's very expensive to fly things around. If you're going to be using them commercially, you're going to need to use something that's very uh, valuable per unit of weight. Because if you move people around, it's too expensive. Nobody's going to pay. The airplanes are too slow and it's too expensive. But gold is very heavy. Sorry, it's very valuable. So per unit of weight, it's the most valuable thing, roughly. And so he decides, all right, let's make a bank clearance system that allows people to move their gold around without having to go through the banking system. So he essentially builds an alternative to central banking using airplanes. If you were a French businessman in 1910 and you wanted to send money to your business partner in Germany, you had to go through your local bank, which would go through the central bank, which would go through the German central bank, which would then go to the business partner in Germany, their own private bank. And it would take time to send that money because they're all sending it to each other and it's pretty slow. So this guy offers you an alternative, which is you can just actually move physical gold on an airplane. You just call him, sends you an airplane, picks up the gold, flies to Germany, drops it off in a day. And now you don't have to trust the bank. You don't have to worry about the bank doing crazy financial shenanigans. You don't have to worry about them going bankrupt. And so this seems like an obscure little thing initially. You know, why would anybody want to pay money to move gold? Banks work just fine. But it succeeds because business benefits from it, and they benefit from having access to their money, but they benefit from not having to trust the banks with their money. But then it really takes off, if you'll excuse the pun, in World War One. Because in World War One, what happened in the real world was that government suspended redeemability, as I mentioned earlier. So they told you, no, you just use the papers, but we won't redeem those papers for gold. So people understand that that means that they're printing more papers, that they're devaluing the value of the papers. And that is a problem. So if you have significant wealth, you'd rather have the gold rather than have the papers. And so this leads to essentially an alternative banking system developing where people move their gold around without having to go through the central bank. And so people don't put a lot of their gold in the central banks, which was what people had to do in the real world in 1914 and 15 and 16. They kept putting their gold into the central banks because the governments forced them to do it, because the government kept insisting, and because you couldn't keep your gold on your own. You couldn't move it around. You know, gold doesn't have wings. But in this novel, we give gold wings, essentially. We make it able to fly quickly. So people don't put their gold in central banks. And when central banks start printing more money, they go bankrupt. And that's the turning point. So in 1915, 1 year into the war, the British, French, Russian, German, Austrian, Turkish currencies all begin to collapse. And the central banks run out of gold, and the governments can no longer support the militaries, and the militaries stop fighting. The soldiers desert the battlefields, and the war ends essentially because nobody can pay the bills anymore. And it's a great thing because people kept their wealth, people stopped killing each other. And you know, if you know the history of World War One, you realize it's a completely pointless and utterly stupid war that changed nothing. After 4 or 5 years of carnage, the changes in the borders of Europe were so small and so insignificant that nobody, the winner or the loser, would tell you that it was definitely not worth all of this carnage for it. you know, whichever country gained a little bit of territory lost so much more in terms of the lives and that had been destroyed. So we get rid of the majority of the destruction because the war ends in 1 year rather than five, just before the war started to get really ugly. And the central banks are bankrupt, the governments are bankrupt, and now we have an alternative monetary system that runs on gold outside of the control of government. Essentially, we have a free market in money. And that works out very well. And that just allows us to go back on a gold standard. And we stay on the gold standard for the rest of the century. And a very different century unfolds.
Well, again, all very interesting, and I love your creativity, your imagination, and able to envision all of that, especially going all the way back to the Wright brothers, and how, I mean, essentially this capitalist system destroyed what they, invented. Well, can you talk a little bit about, you're talking about de you seem to be against central banking and decentralizing money. I don't know anything about Bitcoin, but I have a feeling it is about decentralizing money. Can you talk about how that Bitcoin might be analogous to what you're imagining in your book?
Yeah, that's really the punchline that I'm trying to get to. Is The book is a thought experiment of what would have happened if we had Bitcoin in 1914, at the time when World War One started. And so initially, I had considered um, doing an alternative history where we invent something like Bitcoin in 1914, but it just couldn't really fit because there were no computers. There was there was a whole century of technological innovation that I couldn't cram into a few years. But you could do that with aviation. It was entirely feasible that aviation was just a little bit further. But the point ultimately is just that the adding the adding the airplane to gold makes gold like Bitcoin, in that you can move the gold around without having to go through the central bank, and that's really the key thing, and that's what Bitcoin does. So the reason that governments were able to go on fiat money is because the gold was all centralized, and the reason the gold was centralized is that you couldn't send gold; you had to put it in the bank, and the bank had to put it in the central bank, and so the government sat on a big giant vault of gold, and they were printing receipts or paper money for that gold. And the temptation is just too strong. Now, you take that big giant vault and you distribute the money so that everybody has got their own gold in their pocket. Or, that's kind of what Bitcoin does because it's digital, it's much easier. In the gold example, it's a little bit more centralized. It's not like everybody can send gold from their pocket to their business partner's pocket in another country. You have to go through a bank, and there are clearances, but it's a lot more decentralized than just going through one central bank in each country. And so, because it is decentralized, you can't stop people from sending the money, and you can't stop people from keeping their money on hand. So, essentially, what the airplane does is what Bitcoin does right now. And it is in a sense Bitcoin. It is in a sense a Bitcoin book, in that it's trying to explain how Bitcoin is different, and explain the potential for Bitcoin by making gold more like Bitcoin, and then trying to imagine what the century would have looked like. So, if everybody was using Bitcoin as money today, then governments cannot print Bitcoin. Nobody can print Bitcoin. There are only 21 million Bitcoin. That's the whole value proposition. And the only reason Bitcoin matters is that nobody can make more of it. So they can't make more of it. Well, two reasons. First, nobody can make more of it. And secondly, nobody can stop you from using it. You can just download the software on any computer or phone and receive Bitcoin, send Bitcoin. And it's very difficult for people to even know that this is your Bitcoin when you send it or receive it. So, because of this, uh, because it can't be stopped, and because it's hard and it can't be inflated, that puts a real damper on government's ability to rob your wealth and control you. It makes it very hard for them to steal your wealth through inflation, finance war, and all kinds of horrible things. And it makes it very hard for them to stop you from sending the money. So, that, in my opinion, what it would lead to is a world with a lot less war, a lot less government power, a lot more economic freedom, a lot more wealth. People would be able to accumulate their wealth. I think one of the key points that I tried to communicate with this book is just this thought experiment. Anybody alive today has gone through something like 4 or 5 generations of people being robbed by government money. Government money has been devaluing constantly. So no matter where you live in the world, you and the last 4 or 5 generations of your family have been getting robbed through inflation. And it may have happened through slow inflation, may have happened through hyperinflation, may have happened through capital controls and bank account confiscation, may have happened through banking collapses because of inflation. The ways in which this is manifested are very plentiful, but the end result is the same. Your ability to provide for yourself in the future and for your future, for your descendants, is constantly being compromised by the fact that your money is leaking. Think about it as a leaky bucket. Everybody's been forced to use leaky buckets throughout the last century. So imagine if you replace these leaky buckets of money with buckets that don't leak. So all the last 4 or 5 generations of your family, look back, think about them, think about your own personal family and what they went through. Think about the Great Depression or wherever your ancestors were over the past 100 years or so. If every one of them had access to a form of money that appreciated every year rather than depreciated, it went up in value by 1 or 2%. Think about how different your life would have been, and think about how different the lives of everybody would have been. So many people got ruined over generations by these things. So you take out all of the hyperinflation, banking collapses, and so on, and then you get true accumulation of wealth over generations. That means we end up in a world that is a lot richer, a lot more prosperous than what we have right now. And I think that would have that would have been a very, very, very different world. It would have been a lot of the problems that we see in our world would not exist. I think we'd have a lot less poverty. We'd have a lot less um, uh, homelessness and people unable to afford homes and people living paycheck to paycheck. You'd have savings. People would have savings and they'd be financially stable because they have savings they can fall back on.
Well, you're certainly making a very compelling argument. For listeners that want more of what you're talking about, I know you do have a podcast, you do have a membership program. How can they get more of these lessons and this insight?
Yeah, so my website is saifedean.com, where you can buy my books, and also you can sign up for my online courses. And I do a weekly live seminar with people who take my courses. So the courses are available online for you to take, but you could also sign up and join us for a weekly seminar to discuss the courses, discuss economics in general, discuss my books, and pretty much whatever anybody wants to discuss. And and there's also the Bitcoin Standard podcast. And yeah, you can find my 4 books, and I'm also on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter at Saifedean.
And are you working on another book, another novel? What's next for you?
Well, I think my next book, I haven't started working on it yet, but I have some ideas about what I want to do with it. It's going to be a little bit more of an economics as self-help and how to make better decisions by thinking about the future, and how economics helps you make better decisions in all aspects of your life. But another thing I'm working on is hopefully a movie. I think there's a plan to make a movie out of the Bitcoin standard and out of the gold standard, hopefully.
Well, congratulations on the gold standard and everything that you're doing and working on. And what a fascinating idea, a way to help people like me kind of evaluate and understand these economics and this history and how things can be different. So, congratulations and thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Colin. It was a pleasure chatting to you.